So in fact, I just came back from Australia this weekend, and I'm doing some curatorial work there, as well as bringing some of those Indigenous curators here. So what I'm going to talk about is a series of paintings over the last about 15 years, particularly focusing on the Métis-related works. I do a variety of painting styles and painting themes, but in the last 15 years, it's mostly around that topic. So, as I mentioned, I'm a curator, and I want to talk about all the things I'm not going to talk about. So, these are curators, Indigenous curators from Canada, the ones on the right, and on the left, that same group is mixed in with curators from Australia and New Zealand. And I've done one significant curatorial project with Brenda Croft, who's in the center, and Megan Tamale Quinnell, who's Maori, next to her on the left, from New Zealand, and then Kathleen Ash Milby from the Smithsonian in New York. And we did a show on Indigenous electronic arts about 2 years ago in Adelaide. But I'm back there about six times in the last 6 years, working on building relationships with these people. But I'm not going to talk about the curatorial work. I also teach, of course, here, but also, as you'll see from my work, most of my work is quite didactic, and I'm lucky in this province to be able to take this work around the province, and I see myself as primarily a local artist, working especially on themes of Indigenous identity. I'm also do a lot of writing, not only on Indigenous artists, but artists of all sorts. But here's two catalogs. One is Persona Grata, which is Tanya Harnett, who's from Carry the Kettle Reserve, but teaches at the University of Lethbridge, and Adrian Stimson from Saskatoon, though originally also from Southern Alberta. And that book will be coming out next couple of weeks, maybe a month from now. And it's on his Buffalo Boy performance and Buffalo Boy persona, and I edited that volume. And also, I think it's important to mention that I have a family, and I'm part of a larger family, but also descendant of Métis from, mostly from Alberta, though they originated at Red River and Sault Ste. Marie before that. Here's some aunties, and Jim Brady would be a great uncle of mine. And I don't know if you know Jim Brady at all. Jim Brady was an important figure, a socialist in the 1930s, who, along with Malcolm Norris, fought for Métis reserves in northern Alberta. There were 8 established, of which I think there are 5 left. And they're recognized, the only Métis settlements that are recognized by the provincial government, none are recognized by the federal government. So he did some pretty interesting work. But he primarily lived in Saskatchewan and died in, I think, 1969. And the sort of patriarch of the family is Lawrence Garneau, but his wife, Eleanor, was equally important. He came from Sault Ste. Marie, from French and Anishinaabe heritage, and she's Cree Scottish, and she held property in Red River, and they met there. He would have been in his 20s. Then he got involved in the 1869 resistance, and then moved, because of that, had to move westward and ended up settling in Edmonton, where he was one of the founders of the city. So right across from the Hudson's Bay, I'll show a map later, he set up his house. So in many ways, I've got a lot of influences, so family influences and art influences. And when I was a kid in the 70s, I saw a Joe Fafard exhibition, probably in 1976 or 77, probably at the Glenbow Museum, I think. And I was totally blown away. I loved his work and wanted to be like him. And so I started making figurative sculptures. And this is from 1980. I had my first show. And the first show was actually at an Aboriginal art gallery, the Bear Claw Gallery in Edmonton. And I didn't identify as Indigenous at that point, but when the writer of this article said, well, you're Garneau, you're a descendant of Lawrence Garneau, aren't you? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, you're a Métis, aren't you? And I says, what do you mean? I'd never heard that word used before. Our family didn't use that word. And yet I felt comfortable at 18 showing in an Aboriginal gallery, and it was accepted in there. And I would love to know whose prints were in the back. I met some of the artists while I was living there. And Yeah, so I wanted to make these sculptures, and if you see, they're nowhere near as good as Joe Fafar's. They got better. These are the early ones, but it reminds me of, the Minoans went over to Egypt and they saw, these sculptures and masks and said, wow, we got to make those, and did their version, which were pretty grubby. But I really always wanted to be a painter, so I went to art school at the University of Calgary in the mid-'80s, also in NASCAD in Halifax for a year. And I was taught by formalist painters and drawers who really didn't take to representational painting that well. I didn't really teach it. So in my last years, and especially after graduating, I took my art history textbooks and I made these collages of, I thought there were most interesting, most difficult bits of painting, made the collages and then painted them. So these ones, the one on the left is about 6.5 feet tall and about 5 feet wide. The other one is about 5 by 4, which is kind of the standard size I paint in. And there was this kind of appropriation painting going around at that time in the 80s. And mine was related to that, but I also had themes that I wanted to explore. And primarily there were issues of masculinity. And actually I should go back here because in this article from 1980 for my first show, it says the cut line at the bottom is David Garneau with some of his expressive figurines. He has trouble with women. And to me, that's pretty funny because in the end, masculine themes tend to be the main thing that I was working on. So after school, quite a few years in, I was sort of, missing hundreds of paintings I'm editing out, but I did this, which was probably the most significant piece up to that point. This was in 1997, took a couple of years to make. It's a large painting. There's 2 panels missing from this slide. And the paintings are 8 comic book pages, and they are 6 feet high, and it's about 34 feet long. And it's in the collection of the Glenbow Museum in Calgary, and it's actually up on display right now. They pull it out a lot. It's very strong didactic work. There's so many references. It's a collage made of popular culture images, all representing the settling of the West. So it's actually called How the West Was, ... without the word settling in there, giving the sense that it hasn't been settled yet. And it was shown in the Alberta Biennial in 1998. And Joan Cardinal Schubert had an accompanying piece with it. And she was a very important mentor to me up to this, or long before this point, right out of art school. And it was a real honor to show with her. And later on as a curator, I curated her work too. So these give you a sense of the panels. So each panel is a square or a rectangle, and the squares later on figure in my work a lot because they refer to the North American grid system that's been put over the land versus the French Métis river lot system. But that's just sort of a bit of a code that's hidden in the paintings. And each page has a theme, so I think this is page 3 or page 4, and it's the wannabe Indian section. So there's Gray Owl at the bottom panel. There's a cartoon at the top that says, I am not an Indian, because he's not, he's a painting. But it's also from a 1960s comic book of a white guy who's been adopted into the Sioux culture. And so he's an Indian, but he's not an Indian. So I'm really interested in this play of identities, but particularly of why white folks are interested in appropriating First Nations. And so we have Norman Rockwell painting the big square, and scout leaders holding up a headdress, and just to talk to the boys about it, but what would he be doing with this thing? So superimposed upon it is a crown to give a sense of what its value is. And over on the left, this is another one, so that's the Red River, the resistance in 1885 in Batoche. And over on the side, there's a surveyor. And the surveyors pop up several times in this long painting because they represent the grid that gets imposed over top, in this case over mountains, or in another case over water, and how absurd that really is. So as I mentioned earlier, so this is Laurent Garneau and Eleanor Garneau. And the reason why they're sort of patriarchs of the family, there were Métis before them in both Red River that they come from, and also in Sault Ste. Marie where he comes from. And after they left Red River, they had 12 kids, so it was a big family. But also during the 1885 resistance, even though he was in Edmonton, he was suspected of collusion, which he did. He was colluding with Riel. And there's a number of really good stories. He was a very prominent citizen. In the end, he ran for Parliament a couple times, but because of this incident, he wasn't allowed to take his seat. And so what happened was he was corresponding with Riel, and we're not sure. Other scholars think that he was supplying him, at least with information, if not with goods. He was a trader, moving goods back and forth between Red River and Edmonton. But his property, which is still called the Garnet District to the day, ran right across from the Hudson's Bay fort, or Fort Edmonton. And when the resistance was happening and things were starting to heat up, and Middleton's troops or Strange's troops were coming up from Calgary, everyone was requested to come into the fort. But 85% of them are Métis and First Nations, and they said, well, us too, So he said no. So he and his buddies, they stayed, and they were on the other side of the river, which is sort of the French side leading up to St. Paul or St. Albert. And so that was seen as suspicious behavior. And then also in the middle of the night, one night, he and his buddies were shooting off rifles to sort of have some fun, but people took it seriously. So when the resistance failed in Batoche, the troops came looking for him, and he hid for a while, was eventually arrested, and was going to be hung. And he was held in jail. We don't know how many months, but he had all these kids, and Chief Papascheo, who was from reserve, real close by, and my friend Cheryl Rondell is a descendant of them, took our family in. And so later on, they moved in 1899, 1900, they moved to St. Paul de Métis, which is a Métis village that was set up particularly because all the immigration was coming in from the east. And when Papascheo was sick and dying, Garneau, Lawrence, took him in. And actually, I only learned this from the current chief, Papascheo's chief, that he took him in, but also built him a cabin for his last days. So the relationship is actually pretty strong. And since I've been going back to Edmonton a lot and working on some projects in the future, this relationship with the current chief is really strong. I say that because while I grew up, there was a Karen to Garneau, to Lawrence, but he didn't say anything about Métis or anything like that. Now they're going crazy. So there's 4 or 5 plaques. There's a Garneau tree. They found his tree it's right where the University of Alberta is, and I'm glad because Eleanor's mentioned there. Still no talk about Métis. And then the whole neighborhood is still called Garneau neighborhood. They got all these banners up throughout town. There is one Karen that does talk about his Métis heritage. And it's very public now. It's actually celebrated. There was a conference about 7 or 8 years ago I did a talk at and made some paintings for. And this piece is one of my favorites. I showed it in a large exhibition called Cowboys and Indians, and in brackets, and Métis. And all it is a piece of paper. It's only about this big, and the word Métis is in there, if you can see it, done in charcoal. And then I just spent an hour or two erasing it. And what happens is you can start erasing it, and the main stuff goes away, but then the fibers get embedded, or the charcoal gets embedded in the fibers, and it just won't come out. And an elder that I showed it to in an exhibition in Brandon, Manitoba, said of all the paintings, that was her favorite work because it really did express this sort of notion of erasure and whitening, if you want to say it. But also, what was significant too was it alludes to what happened in 1885. So when the troops were coming up, my great-great-grandmother had letters from Riel, or we were told her from Riel, and she had her washboard out, and she took them and was washing them away into the water to destroy them. And so you have this clever way of getting rid of evidence, but also this sad loss of these documents. And I know Sherry Farrell-Rissette often laments, whenever we get together, she says, what was in those letters? What was lost? Not just in this instance, but many instances. So I've done a whole series of paintings in any number of styles, and I'm just going to show you a few. So this is patrimony, and that's the idea of what's passed down from father to son, the idea of a noose. And Métis were quite free people, like First Nations people, self-organized for sure, but certainly put into harness after 1885. but also the silencing that happened as a result of fear, and legitimate fears, of course. This is Bob Boyer, who was a mentor when I came here 15 years ago. I met him in Calgary before moving here, but he had a big influence. You'll see even some of the formal things he does later on. But after meeting him and really getting to know him, I did this painting, which was one of my first sort of coming out paintings. This is from about 13 years ago. And it was actually from Neil McLeod's Crow Hop Cafe. And he asked me to do some painting, some banners for the back. So I did 3 of them, and this is just one of them, all on similar themes. So, you know, it's this range of Métis-ness from more or less fully assimilated to Métis who identify more as First Nations. And Bob danced powwow. So, in fact, he died dancing powwow, which is pretty remarkable. So these 2 characters are looking at each other, and you know, which one's Métis, or any of them Métis? You know, so it's this range, this wide range in between. So I express this in a number of different ways. So this is me coming to my Métis-ness. I'd certainly done explorations and with Métis people, particularly First Nations people in Alberta. But when I moved here, it was like I was accepted, not like, I was accepted right away, got on the board of Sagawewalk, and was encouraged. Actually, as Bob Boyer came to my office and said, you know, I know your family history, and you can sit on the fence, or you should jump on one side of the fence or the other. Right now, you're on the fence. So I decided really to jump in, and it led to a whole lot of responsibility as well, you know, being out in terms of my family too. So I was trying to find ways of expressing what this felt like or what it's like. So this is a famous duck rabbit. So a psychological test, you know, do you see a duck or a rabbit? It's both. It's a bistable image. And I was interested in what happens when duck rabbit meets duck rabbit. These were paintings for a comedy exhibition that Neil McLeod put together at the Mackenzie. So on one hand, you've got duck rabbit on the left, looks at duck rabbit on the right. They're both the same, both Métis. But if this guy looks at the other guy, he thinks of himself as a duck looking at a rabbit. And the guy on the other side, though he's both at the same time or one new thing, he looks the other way and he composes himself as a rabbit for what he thinks is a duck. And for me, that was the kind of relationships you have when you're talking to First Nations people. You speak differently than when you're talking to non-Aboriginal people. And so I've expressing that in different ways too. This one is one of my favorites. This one, as was mentioned, is in the collection of Indian and Northern Affairs. And it expresses this, especially the educational complexity. So there's learnings you can have as a buffalo on a grandfather from the land, and then book learning too. And the book learning character is a cow, and there's a oil derrick in the back because my dad worked in the oil industry. But there's this tension between the two. Are you one or the other? Can you be both? And I showed this Fort McMurray, I think it was maybe a dozen years ago. And this kid comes up to me afterwards and he says, well, the one on the left is a lot happier. You know, his horns are intact. He's a little flesher, warmer color. I just love the way people interpret things, and they want to talk about this painting more than most that I have, you know, and how they position in between. So like I say, I painted in a bunch of different styles. This is a color discrimination test. So if you're colorblind, you just see a series of dots. But if you see the figure in between, it's a figure infinity symbol, so the Métis flag. And the idea here is because Métis people, you know, can look like more First Nations or more European, you have to discriminate to understand who we are. So I'm just show a couple of sculpture works. So what you do is you get this toy from Walmart, or actually you buy a whole bunch of them, these John A. MacDonald dolls, and he's of course responsible for the hanging of Riel. And you put in a little noose, and then you put it back in the package, and then you put it back on the shelf. So this is my Métis dream catcher. It's barbed wire and baling twine. This one was collected recently by the Montreal Museum of Art. This one, so all these things are related for me, but they don't seem to be, you know, at first. These slides are quite washed out. It's quite a rich color painting. The style in the background is from the Group of Seven, Josh McDonald's Tangled Gardens in that style. But it's a weed, and I'm really interested. I've written a lot around the space of the ditch as the space between, you know, the highway and the cultivated lands, and it's often where I've been told that indigenous plants. I worked with a soil scientist. He wanted me to teach painting to his grad students so they could understand the land a little bit better. But he taught me more than I learned. But a lot of indigenous plants only survive in these strange stretches. So this is a weed from photographs in 3 seasons. So spring at the top and fall at the bottom, somewhere in between. And it's also, there's so much, this is so loaded for me. It's an autobiographical piece. It takes place, I found it very close to a lake that we had a cabin at for many generations, and I actually had a car accident right near here. And so it's got a lot going for me in it. So even though it's less literal, it still fits in. Similarly with these paintings, this is a series of roadkill paintings. So I was doing a lot of research looking for Métis sites on the prairies, and on the way I was collecting these roadkill, and they have a particular meaning for me, and there's not enough time to talk about it all. All these are large paintings, 5 by 4 feet. But there's always a tension, not always, in many of my works, a tension between abstraction and representation, and also memento mori themes, so themes about death come up a lot. These and one other set are the closest things that come to really spiritual type works. Oh, I have to tell you a funny story of this one. So I was up, it was north of Carrot River, and I can't remember the community, but I was treated really well. These paintings were circulated around the province, and they often went to small communities where they'd be just set up in a room like this or a gymnasium. And there's one setting near, I think it was at Carrot River. They set it up in the gymnasium, and then the local community came and they did powwow dancing and brought in food. It was just a wonderful time. And so this elder guy came up to me and was saying, you know, at the time I was saying this work didn't really fit in. He says, of course it does. And I said, well, how do you see it fitting in? And I thought he would be talking about, you know, the road allowances, that space of the ditch, the space between properties as well, which I was really interested in. But he says, well, no, so let me see if I get this right. You're traveling down the road, and it was the Carleton Trail, which is mostly, it's the Yellowhead Highway now, which is actually named after a Métis guy, Tet Jean. And he said, so you travel on this highway, and you're looking for Métis sites, but you're finding roadkill. So you're going to those animals, you're taking photographs, and then you're going back to your studio. See if I got this right. You're stretching canvases, and then you're painting them, and then you sell it. I said, yeah, that's pretty much. I don't sell a lot of them, but that's the idea. He says, well, then it's a trap line. So you're selling your skins that you've collected. I thought, oh, that's pretty cool. So I don't always show them, but they make sense with that kind of contextualization. So this is Lac La Nunne, which is in just about an hour's drive north of Edmonton. That is a really important lake for us, for our family. So we had a cabin that was built in the 1930s or 40s, just over to the right. But on the island, my grandparents had a cabin with 2 other Métis families for years and years. And then I only learned this about 20 years ago, across the river, across the lake, over on that side, my uncle, Jerry's wife, who's also Métis, her grandfather was a chief, and they still lived there. And this lake had been used for hundreds of years for, supplying people going up to the gold rush, for fish and so on, but it was used a lot. And Lac St. Anne is very close by, like 20 kilometers away. And that's it's a sacred site, a sacred lake, which ceremonies are still done there. Sometimes, or the big one is where 10,000 people come every summer, is very Catholic. So these are real touchstones for me. I still visit that place all the time. A couple summers ago, I rented a cabin at the other lake. And so I just want to use that as touchstone. Nature is a very big part of what motivates me. But what I found when I moved to Regina particularly is the place is so cultivated. There's not a lot of nature. And so when I was looking for these Métis sites, I started off going to all the typical sites and realized that I was driving all the way through. All the history of this land has been cultivated and kind of erased. So I wanted to record that idea with this sort of drive-by painting idea. And here's just a number of them. So they're really nice paintings, but what they record is how they're different from most landscape paintings around here is landscape painters mostly work by taking photographs, going to the studio and painting. And I wanted to show that what really happens is they take photographs. So this way, you know I'm taking photographs from the car. So it seems like a pastorale, but it's really not. At the same time, I did a whole series of these where I wanted to show the influence of other artists. So it looks like a regular scene. This is actually me driving up to Emma Lake, and there's a lot of formalist painters who taught there in the late 50s and into the 60s and 70s. And you can see at the bottom there's something suspicious going on, and it's actually based on one of these formalist painters, Robert Motherwell, and I've done a whole series of these. So this is Agnes Martin, is a very famous minimalist painter, thought to be an American, but she was born in Saskatchewan at Macklin, a really teeny little town, only lived here 2 years. And so I went looking for her hometown, and this one's called Near Macklin because I was about 20 kilometers away and it was starting to get dark, so I took it at this time. This is much more typical. So I do a lot of work at the Batash site, and I'm actually on the management board, chair of the management board, Batash site, which is a Métis management. And these are 3 paintings from the battle scene, actually very close to each other. So the first one, these slides are really washed out, but the first one shows the site where actually most of the people were buried, sort of in a group. But the idea was, it was called Remember the Sacred Wood. That's a name of a poem that Riel wrote, one of his last poems he wrote while in custody. But I wanted to get the idea, it sort of blends with the background so that the structure comes from the trees, and if, it'll have to be replaced, like a memory has to be replaced. Similarly, this center panel, this is owned by Indian Northern Affairs too. The center panel, this is the idea of the fallen soldiers. You can see kind of a bayonet at the top right-hand corner, and this is like a howling horse that's sort of from a Picasso painting, Guernica. But the idea of the fallen soldiers and the dead wood and new life springing up. Each of these are 3 seasons. This is fall, and this is a screen of trees and the church is behind. And it's really talking about this tension between the church and the Catholic Church and the priest who betrayed the Métis at that time. There's always been a tension after that. There's so many other stories in this one. So in terms of working on my strategy for art, I really wanted to record my experience, record a bit of history, but I was doing it all in what you'd call a Western mode. And I don't know if I'll ever really get out of that Western mode because it's my training. But I was looking at Métis material culture, the flower bead people, and really want to interpret that, use that, because it's remarkable work. And the Métis were known for their translations. They found a style that was between, especially Sioux patterns and Anishinaabe patterns and other patterns, and European patterns that were taught by the nuns. And Sherry Farrell-Rosette's done the most exquisite work on this, trying to show who did what and the influences. I find it really fascinating, and because of poverty and other things, it kind of died out. It was a bit of a flicker and then has recently revived. But unlike Sioux patterns, there isn't a lot of meaning in them. I don't think, Sherry and I go through all the material and we try and find hidden codes. I don't think they're in there. But that hasn't stopped people who are reviving these traditions from coming up with new ideas. Anyway, so I thought I'd better take up beading. And I was too shy to approach someone to teach me how to bead and didn't want to learn from a book. This thing is only this big, and it took me 100 hours, and it's awful. And so I decided that's not for me. So I decided to translate it to painting. So this is a map of Edmonton. I wanted to show that it was a French Métis community that was based on the river lots. I'd done a talk at the University of Alberta, and I was surprised that no one there, and these are scholars, knew that Edmonton was French Métis community, 85%. And you could tell by the patterns. So in both resistances in 1869, 70, and 1885 were over this, right? So these were the patterns that the French Métis set up in Red River and Batoche and Edmonton and St. Albert and all these smaller places. And the Canadians wanted to put the grid, the square over top. And that's literally what the first battle was at. Riel puts his foot on the chain, refusing the surveyors from staking out the land because he knew it was going to translate it and they would lose their property rights. And so I want to show this map. Since then, so Laurent Garneau's land is this part here, and it seems perverse to put it off to the side, but I've since learned that colonial maps tend to have the colony or the fort in the middle and then all the supposed dangers around her, whereas Aboriginal maps around the world tend to have where you are and where we want to go and all the resources and stuff in between. I thought that was fascinating. I just did this intuitively. Here's Red River, which is much more complex because there were more generations and they sort of subdivided the land, and those strips would literally be maybe only about twice as wide as this room. There's a couple still existing, like where they have the Riel house, and you can also see these at Batoche too. Pretty fascinating. So I find it interesting to show these little sites of resistance that persists. They're archived in a way, but I think it's pretty interesting. But for me, it was also trying to find a way to make representations that were closer to Métis, that are contemporary, but not quite. And I was looking at Alex Janvier, and Alex is a totally big influence on me. So St. Paul de Métis is just south of where they're at Cold Lake, Alberta. And the residential school is actually right in between the two that Alex went to. And his paintings are amazing. So many of them are simply formalist paintings, abstract paintings, but many of them, especially from the late 60s and through the 70s, they're maps of the region. And maps like this have been used in the past, older maps, for land claims. And I think certainly in the way the work was displayed 2 years ago at the Edmonton Art Gallery, it was showing that they were maps, you know, they were land claims. But no one's done any work on this at all. And he's still alive, you should be talked to about it. But I went to a talk of his 20 years ago where he explained, you know, what each thing was. And I was blown away, you know, that these secret codes were in there. I could talk about Alex's work all day long, but look at that title from '72. It's astounding, the ideas that embedded in that title. The notion of coming into Western culture, even if you want to hold on to your ways, means you're going to have to adapt and be co-opted into the cash nexus. And it's so smart. He's such a smart artist. There he is. So then I went to Australia, and damn it, I didn't know their work at all, but they do these dot painting things. Aboriginal art in Australia is the most popular art. They're only 3% of the population, but 3/4 of the art sold in Australia is Aboriginal, Indigenous art. And they're maps. And just this weekend, or just on Friday, I was in Australia for last week, and I've shown this work to Indigenous artists before, and this time it was to Indigenous artists and scholars and curators. And they just loved it. But they loved the idea that Alex was doing it, because they did these maps on walls and so on, but they only started doing paintings in 1971-72 at Parramatta. And it was a white artist brought in these paints and so on, and acrylic paints, and they took to it right away. They did this big mural inside their school called the Honey Ant Dreaming that just totally transformed the culture and created a new economy. But the work is so powerful, so amazing. I mean, it was already there. It's one of the oldest cultures, 40,000 years of continuous existence, recorded anyways. And, but they love the idea that what some of us are doing here rhymed what they were doing there. But then there's another set of influences that I didn't know. Oh, I don't have time to talk about St. Madeleine. Christy Belcourt. So she's doing dot painting, and her idea was beading too, same as me. And I've since met her and, you know, talked to her. She was doing it before me, so I can't say I was copying, but so I decided I got to come up with something different that's not Australian Aboriginal art and not what Christy's doing. So I started doing these screens, and I did the screens for a number of reasons. There's not enough time, but I did this painting of Neil Stonechild, and I was just totally compelled to do this painting. And I couldn't show it or anything, but then out of sweat, this little dots of light came up, and I thought of this idea of creating the screen to sort of protect him inside there, or protect us from him. So this is the Carlton Trail that still exists at Batoche, and the screen over top. And the dots are unorganized, but very soon I would go into the collections and I thought, I want those dots to be meaningful. So I started looking at all the beading that was done and making elaborations on it. And doing a few things with teepees. I think teepees are fascinating because they're a combination of Sioux culture, but also European fabric, right? And I thought that might be a little controversial, and I was talking to Colleen Cuttrall, who's Nakota, I think, used to teach. She just retired from Brandon. And she said in the 1870s, and I found, she showed me slides or images, in the 1870s they ran out of the unbleached cotton, so they had denim teepees. But of course the cotton allows you to make a bigger teepee that can travel longer. You know, it's not as warm, but it was a bit more efficient. So I think it's sort of this nice mixing of cultures. So I thought that I would use that in my work. And all but two, there are a dozen of these paintings, all but two of them are from actually Métis sites, so Métis people using them. This gives you an example of what it looks up close. But then what I focused on is the top of the teepee. And part of it was a teaching that I was given out of sweat, and also something from Western philosophy. So for me, I'm interested in this moment in between. So at the bottom, we have our corporeal bodies, so our rib cage and clothed, and then spiritual forms going up at the top. And I'm just really, it just satisfies something for me. And then the images, or the dots, and this one, it's called At the Fiddle Camp, so it's at the Arcan Fiddle Camp. He had a teepee set up. I took a photograph of the top of it, and wanted to evoke music through the dots. And different things happen in other ones. And people were always saying, oh, I see these images in there. And actually my daughter at the time said, put a rabbit in there. So I put a rabbit in, and then I started doing more. So this one has a dragonfly. Each of the images were based on a dream, or, well, not the next one, but this one was based on a dream. This one's got a rib cage and butterfly wings. I've done a whole series without the dots, and sometimes it looks like it's torn, or it's twisted, or it's regal. I'm finding so much affective feeling from just this top of the teepee. I found it really, really interesting. Jumping on to other kinds of work, so this is a hodgepodge. So this is Riel. This is a large painting. It's 8 feet high by 5 feet, or sorry, 8 feet by 5 feet in 2 panels, and it's based on the Jacques-Louis David painting. And as you saw from the earlier slides, I really wanted to learn, because I wasn't taught these sort of skills of mastery in painting in school. I had to learn on my own. I want to reuse those tools. So this painting actually has a lot of research in it. So there's a lot of translations. So the saddle is actually, I couldn't find Riel's saddle, but I found Gabriel Dumont's saddle. So the beading is Gabriel Dumont's beading. The knife is a trade knife that was used at the time, but I couldn't find his particular one. But Louis Riel's jacket, the beading, and you can just see it on the front here, was from the jacket that I showed earlier. There's 2 of them. There's one in the Glenbow collection and one in the Museum of Civilization. And the hat was typical of the time. And so this is from an event at Batoche, where he sort of took charge and tried to buoy his troops up, and he was being shot at, but they were all missing him, and that sort of got everybody excited. But there's also an in-joke too, so it's Napoleon, and his sort of Riel at this point certainly had aspirations of that sort, but also he changed his name after Epiphany he had in Washington just, well, about 8-9 years before this point, and he gave himself a middle name of David, and of course I'm David, and that painting is by Jacques-Louis David, so it's sort of a little in-joke. I'm just going to race through a few others. This is a part of a series I did on Neil Stonechild, who was murdered by the police in 1990. It affected me a lot when I first heard about it when I came here in 1999. And I did a few paintings, but they weren't understood at all. They were too elliptical. And so I did ones that were much more direct. And this is my favorite one. This one was shown up in Saskatoon, and I was told that kids from the White Buffalo Lodge were coming over and retelling the story by touching the painting and remembering this is his last day, all those things. So that S is his tattoo, the handcuffs where the cops made into brass knuckles, and the scars on his face, where he was found, all things. There's a little bit of transcripts from the court proceedings later on, all kinds of things. But I really thought this idea of a painting that could be a touchstone for a community was really important, and it's something that I'm working on in this project I'm going to work on in the summer. Here are river lot paintings, so I'm interested. This is what Batash Map of Batoche looks like. This one's really wonderful. It's a map I found of 1866 or 67, maybe 68, the La Salle River in southern Manitoba. But it's a moment the map records both systems. So you can see a bit of a grid underneath, and the map makers couldn't tell like which way things were going to go. And then the maps the very next year don't have the river lots at all. They're totally turned into European, Canadian designs. Current work is I'm doing a series of quilts. They're painted, they're not real quilts. And these are the two flags. Next year is the 200th anniversary of actually it's of the red one. The blue one came a couple of years later. That's the French one. Comic books. These two paintings were shown in the Mackenzie, but they're going to be shown in Montreal coming up. I've been trying for ages to paint powwow and not always succeeding, but these ones come close. This is my Indian casino quilt. This one's called Cultural Exchange, and Neil MacLeod's got a book of poetry and other Indigenous writing coming out, and I've got some poems in there, and he chose that one for the cover. It's graffiti from Australia and from Winnipeg, from Melbourne and from Winnipeg, collaged together. Oh, this is two meetings. This is the Aboriginal, no, the one on the right is the Aboriginal Curatorial Collective meeting in Ottawa, in which a crazy incident happened. And this is one of our meetings, Shawneen. And all the different skin tones thinking, what's going on? What are we going to do? Here's an example. This is a Métis quilling work that doesn't look like anything else. And I just love this. And there's one other piece that's in the Edmonton collection at the Royal Alberta Museum and has had a big influence on me. You know, you can see a little bit of trace that seems to come from the nuns' French embroidery, but also a little bit of Sioux stuff maybe happening at the top. But whoever made this is doing something kind of unique. So moving away from the dots, I'm thinking about moving it to quill painting. This one's kind of an abstract sampler, but also looks like maybe an aerial view. These are the Métis flag, but the intersection, kind of a quilling. I'm not sure where these are going to go. This is called the Edmonton Knife. Again, a very unique design, so this kind of hybrid. And the curator at the Royal Alberta Museum was hoping it could be traced to Laurent Garneau, and it precedes him by 1 year. So he came there in 1871, I think, and it's from 1870. They found records of who ordered the beads, so I thought that's fascinating. So this is one of those trade knives that I used in the Riel painting. And so I'm making fishing leaders. These aren't very big paintings based on the design. I don't know where that's going to go. I also did vamps for Christy Balcourt's project. And this one's based on another painting that I did. And it's the Métis flag broken into two tiers. This is some Idle No More work. So these are a series of drawings based on round dances that I was involved with and so many other people. This is sort of abstractions. This is sort of my magnum opus, like the first one, the big How the West Was painting. This one's taken, well, I started January 15th of last year. So it's an Idle No More quilt, and there's thousands of individuals. So I think there's 16 panels, and they're from hundreds of photographs I got off the web that people were sharing from November 22nd or so to January 15th. And sort of the height of the Idle No More movement. So I also do video work. This is a piece from 1999. It's called Black Pepper. And I pulled this out because recently I'm working with different scholars and organizations around Indian residential schools and art. And I've actually on a shirt grant. It's not directly about that. It's mostly about what's after, what follows, what I call creative conciliations. And But this is a piece a personal piece I did that I ended up on. It ended up touring across Canada in an Indigenous show in about 2002, I think. And it's a very simple piece. There's a guy there, Corey Cardinal, and I'm just telling him a story. I worked in Edmonton in a residence that mostly Aboriginal kids who were wards of the state, taken from the parents who were in jail or before they were going to foster care. It was sort of a crisis place. But it was almost a residential school, but the school was down the street. And parents could come to visit on Sundays. It was just a scene of constant agony and tragedy. And I only worked there for a little while. But the summer camp was at Lac St. Anne, right next to the sacred site. So it just wraps up all kinds of feelings for me. But when I was out at the lake, there was a little boy from Fort Chipewyan who was about 5 years old. And he was constantly swearing, and the nuns, it was run by nuns. I mean, it's so much like a residential school. Run by nuns, and the nuns didn't like it, and so told me to feed him a spoonful of black pepper. I was 17 and I did it, and to my lasting shame. And so when they were talking about residential schools and they wanted me to do some work on it, I said, I've got nothing to say. And then I was going back, looking through my work, and I remembered this piece. And yeah, it sort of was a little foothold to think about things in a personal way. So all it is me on the other side of the camera telling this guy, Corey, 20 years later, what I did, what happened, and he's just listening, just taking it in. It's a pretty strong piece. It was shown in Saskatoon as well and a few other places. This I'm working on a piece. This is with Clement Ye, a Chinese-Canadian. These are apology dice, and they're really big. They're about this big. And it says, we are, I am, they are. So you'd roll that, we are. Fairly, so, very, not, sorry. We're sorry, we're not sorry, we're fairly sorry. Part of it is this expression of how some of this is turned into a game and it's random, and can you really trust any of the responses coming around these issues? On a happier note, though, last summer I made this video at Standing Buffalo based on a scene I'd seen about 8 years before and had recorded. I saw these guys playing basketball at a powwow in Saskatoon, and I thought it was just great. You know, they're all in the regalia and it's between dances and they're keeping in shape, having a ball. And so I asked some guys to help me out, and so we went out to Standing Buffalo, and the powwow grounds are just over there and the school's over here. And the video is it's short, it's only 5 minutes. And it starts off with them just shooting, or first of all, you just see the abstract regalia, and then you're probably sure that it's regalia as we zoom back a bit. And then suddenly a basketball's in there. And so I was trying to show about the continuity of the culture and yet still adopting present values and making something unique out of it. But also, a lot of my work especially writing work, has been about masculinity. So I'm interested in showing the video ends with them in the dressing room taking off their regalia, and you get a sense it's like a locker room anyways. And one of the guys was Teddy Bison, Roy Bison's son, who was actually one of my students. And when we finally got out there, I said, were you in a class with me? This is the last painting I'll show. This was painted last year, and it was shown in Quebec, only in Quebec, right after it was still wet paint practically, and was shown a lot in lots of magazines and so on. It's going to be a cover of a book coming out. I forgot from where. So that's me talking fast. I don't know if you have any questions.
Basketball is Mesoamerican.
Yeah. Yeah, it's traditional. It's funny, right? And basketball's Canadian, so there you go. Now we have to find out if, I forgot his name, if he was Métis. Wouldn't that be something? I remember it was a shock when I found out that the Yellowhead Highway is named after a blonde Métis guy from Quebec. So that was pretty interesting.
It demonstrates such a breadth of work.
Thanks.
Unbelievable.
Well, the first slide I showed, my first show was in 1980, so I've been at it a little while. And it just was heartbreaking to edit things out Sometimes I just want to take a little Eddie and follow that up, or those, especially around more unsettled issues of identity. There's a lot of paintings along that level, and I love showing those in schools, especially high schools. And it's funny because, so I've been here about 15 years. When I first started showing those works in schools, how many kids are Métis? No hands would go up. And now they shoot right up. There's been some changes. Yeah.
Fantastic. I love what you're doing in the transition that you demonstrated today between the beadwork, the dot paintings, and where you're going with the teepees. Those ones are just so, they're magical.
Well, I'm glad you like them.
And I like your reference to the word spiritual. They really are.
Yeah.
There's a lot going on there.
I'm reluctant and I'm careful, but the first ones, actually it's not in here, but it truly was. I was, a friend of ours was signing her papers or doing the forms for the compensation here in Regina, and she didn't have a car, so we took her out, and it was on the RCMP grounds or something. And as I was, walking around waiting, this Scapio runs up to me and says, "You got to come and sweat." And it was like out of the blue, right? And it came at just the right time because I was struggling with this. Well, what I was going to do in painting, but what I was going to do with this Neil Stonechild painting, and a lot of stuff came together. So the first painting was, of course, I'm not representing the sweat, but the elder said I could do the teepee. But it was like the top part suddenly struck me as being really important, and I didn't get it until I was actually in the studio, what it could mean. And that one is, it's centered right in the middle, and there's sort of a spiral that comes out. And it's in that painting, and those paintings, they're way more intuitive and, less didactic and more open. But I feel that it's communicating a bit of where I'm at.
You knew exactly which one to take us back to.
Well, I really love this at the fiddle camp, because you don't think of Métis and teepees, but geez, everywhere I go, even back to Batoche, there's always one teepee at least. It's an in-between type of thing, and but they're never painted, which is respectful in my view, right? That's I'm really interested we're interested in David Benjo's inside, what happens inside, and for me, with Métis culture, there's still a lot of a blank slate there. Very few artists are emerging. We need to move forward. So hopefully this will kickstart a little bit of that. Any last questions?
I like your struggling with the ambiguity of being what it is to be Métis.
Yeah.
Really, it really hits home. It really resonates.
Well, that's good. A friend of mine, Chris Anderson, is going to be coming out with a book, and he's taken this very tough line on who's Métis, and I don't agree with him, but I still qualify, 2 generations of people who got script, so they were recognized. But there are all kinds of people who never identified as First Nations. I've got, going back family members who didn't take script and are now First Nations people in central Manitoba that I've never met, but I've been told about. And there are so many things that are divisive. And when I was in Alberta growing up, things were very divisive, and so I just didn't put my hand up very much. But when we came here, things are way more accepting and much more fluid, and I think are building faster because there's so many more collaborations. That I find very encouraging. But if it weren't for people like Cheryl Rondell and especially Bob Boyer, and there are actually a number of others, and Neil McLeod and others, who started making these things interesting, and then I could see painting as making a cultural contribution that I didn't quite see in the same way before. I think that was significant, and I do see it as part of an intellectual struggle, and I find it so much fun taking some of these paintings to the community and have them talk about it and discuss it. And I was probably the highlight of my career was showing at Wanuskewin Park, and I showed about 26 paintings, and I was the first Métis person to show in the big room there. Leah Dorian showed in the smaller room for sure. And there were a lot of First Nations people, I was told they didn't want to go in there. And then it was up for like 3 months. Okay, I'll eventually go and take a look. And Robert Doucette too. And I was afraid there was other paintings that didn't show, like Riel with nooses around his neck and so on, that people would be offended by. And they didn't like all the pictures, but they could get what the project was, you know, that's trying to tell the story in a different way and not always in a, yeah, everything's great or everything was bad kind of way. One thing I do respect with Chris Anderson's work highly is how he's going past 1885 and looking at, you know, how people identified themselves and lived in the 20th century. That's really important work. And at Batoche, we're working on telling those stories now in the next couple of years and expanding what that space means. So this back and forth scholarship is really, really important. Well, thank you for coming.